I'm going to be talking to you this morning about some work that I've been involved in, thinking about ways to reduce anxiety and anxiety disorders in children. And in order to do that, I first want to tell you a little bit about the role of attention in our lives. So I've been spending a good bit of time recently in New York City. And here's a picture of what it's like to be walking on a New York City street. So imagine yourself walking on the street, and what you can see is, I like to think of myself as a running back, sort of, paying attention and following a block and walking through the crowd. But there's a lot of things that are going on in this street. And what we have learned to do over the years is we've learned to block out the irrelevant things that are going on and to focus on the important things. We've learned to not be distracted by things that are going on, either in front of us or in the periphery. And we've learned to pay attention to what is important in order for us to get from point A to point B. Those are primary attentional constructs. So if I think about attention, right? Well, first of all, attention doesn't mean the same thing to all people. There are a huge range of phenomena that we talk about when we talk about attention, right? So 4 interrelated ideas that are important. The first is we are always confronted with much more information in the environment than we can pay attention to. Think about that scene that I showed you walking the streets of New York, right? There's just a lot going on, and we can't pay attention to everything that's going on. The second, there are constraints, right, to the amount of attention that we can give to any one thing at any one time. I know there's a lot of work now on multitasking. You think about it, right? And you see people who are driving and texting, using their hands, or even thinking about talking on the phone. Well, it is true that there are more accidents for people who are multitasking when they're driving. And now, I don't know if they're here in California, but certainly out on the East Coast, there's a major public awareness of that with billboards and messages all over the place about that. So it's really quite important. The third is we can respond to some information and perform some tasks without much paying attention, So think about it this way. When you get into your car and you start driving, right, you are paying attention, hopefully, to what's going on the road, but you're not really paying attention to all of the steps that go on in order for you to get into the car, to turn the car on, and to navigate your way onto the 405. That's the big highway here, right? Okay. It's not the Washington Beltway, let me tell you, but right? So we do a lot of things automatically. In fact, if I had to ask you how much of what we do is automatic versus how much is conscious, what would you say? Let's see. Just shout out. What % of our daily activities are automatic versus conscious, willed activity? All right, hold on. How many say 50%? Okay, we've got a few. 60, 70, 80. Yeah, there we go. 80%. 80% of our daily activities are unconscious. They are automatic, right? We are on automatic pilot in terms of the kinds of things that we do all the time. Now, the point is here that with sufficient practice and knowledge, some things become more easy to do with fewer attentional resources. Think about it as riding a bike. After a while, you get very good at riding a bike, and you don't really pay attention to the balance and to the pedaling and to all of the things that a young child has to learn in order for them to become expert at that activity. Okay. The other thing about attention is that we select what we want to listen to. This is also called the cocktail effect, right? You're at a cocktail party, you're at a large crowd, and people are talking. And what you do often is you ignore many stimuli that are going on, and you try to focus. I say try because it takes effort, right? It does take effort in order to attend to somebody who's talking to you in the midst of a loud and noisy environment. And we try to ignore the distractions that must be eliminated or excluded in order for us to have a conversation. So when we think about selective attention, there are two things that we need to remember. The first is that selective attention can occur very early in the processing stream, based on very low-level characteristics, right? We just need to hear a few words. We just need to hear not every word, but some of the words in order to get the gist of what somebody is saying. The second is that it can be influenced by many different factors. So, for example, if you hear your name, you're going to be drawn to whoever mentioned your name, right? And so that happens very quickly. And the other thing is, if you are personally more vigilant, then you're going to be more aware of what's going on in your environment than someone who may not be. Now, vigilance is an interesting term because it is the term that is associated most with the notion of anxiety when we think about anxiety. When Pat asked me to talk about attention and anxiety today, I decided, okay, what I would do is I would go to my bookshelf and find the book that I read, believe it or not, many years ago in graduate school called The Problem of Anxiety by Freud. And I spent a while reading the book, trying to ignore all the issues about castration anxiety. And finally, I got to the point where Freud started talking about vigilance and fear. And the idea was that attention was prominent. As he says here, it's certain that the problem of fear is the meeting point which expresses itself in heightened sensory attention and motor attention, right? So Freud recognized all those years ago that attention was critical in terms of anxious behavior and in terms of anxiety. Now, there's been a lot of work on anxiety disorders and attention. Whole volumes that have been written, lots of studies that have been written. And that research suggests that anxious people are more vigilant, that they are more aware of their environments than non-anxious people. And that is particularly true about emotional or social stimuli, which they may find threatening. What's also important to know is that neuroscientists have found the circuits in the brain that are responsible for that heightened vigilance, right? So we now know through functional neuroimaging on anxious people, what are the circuits that are activated in an anxious person when they are confronted with threat, when they're confronted with a threatening face, for example, compared to a non-anxious person. Now, if you know that, then what you can do is you can try to develop training programs, intervention programs that use that neuroscience knowledge to be able to help people who are anxious, to be able to help children who have an anxiety disorder to reduce that anxiety. So, as I say here, the bias, that anxiety bias, that attention bias to threat that anxious people have, that's now the target of interventions. And in fact, it's the target of the intervention that I'm going to tell you about this morning. So, first a little background. It is normal in our everyday lives to detect threat, right? That is a circuit, the circuit that I'm telling you about in the brain. It is conserved across species and across evolution, because all species have to be aware of their predators, and they have to be able to identify threat from their predators. So we all have that circuit, and it's the same circuit whether you are a reptile or a non-human primate or a person who is trying to detect a threat. Now, the question is, how are these biases that we all have, because we're all very good at detecting threat, how are these biases perturbed in an anxious individual? So we know that anxious adults and children show this hypervigilance. I already told you that. What you don't know, and what I'm going to tell you about today and tell you how we measure that, is that anxious individuals, unlike non-anxious individuals, have a hard time disengaging from threatening stimuli. That is, unlike you or me, and I'm assuming that we're all very non-anxious after Pat's meditation earlier this morning, unlike you or me, anxious people have a very hard time disengaging from a threatening stimulus, and in fact, they prefer to allocate their attention towards threat. So how do we measure this allocation toward threat? I'm going to show you a task that is used widely in the anxiety literature and that we've used for a number of years with children to identify anxiety disorders and a biomarker, if you will, for children with anxiety. And it's called the dot probe task. It was developed by a group in Australia, a guy named Colin MacLeod, many years ago. And it's very simple. All you're going to do is you're going to see a cross, right? A fixation cross. And then the next thing that you see are two faces, a threatening face and a neutral face. Now, I'm going to go through this very slowly, and then I'll see if I can go backwards and do it at the real-time way in which children and adults play this game. But the next thing that you see are two dots. And the participant's task is simply to use their right hand if the dots are horizontal and the left hand if the dots are vertical. So in this case, they press the right hand, okay? Now another fixation cross, now another two faces, and now, right, it's, remember, which hand is it? Left, right? Now, what did you know, right, what did you notice, let's go back, what did you notice about where those two dots were located? In the first instance, right, the two dots are located, they're co-located in the same space where the threatening face existed, right? Here you go. And in this case, they are co-located in the neutral face, right? Everybody see that? So now, if you are an anxious individual, you're very quick to identify the two dots when they're co-located with a threatening face. If you are a non-anxious individual, you can do it, but you're slower. If you're an anxious individual, when the two dots are co-located in the place where the non-threatening face was, you're slower, right? You can't disengage from threat, okay? So again, there you see it, and there's the dot probe, and what we know is that in terms of reaction time, anxious individuals are faster when it's a congruent trial, and they're also slower when it's an incongruent trial. And there are a bazillion studies that have been done in the research literature with adults with anxiety to show that that is in fact the case. And in fact, many studies that have been done with adults with this task in the fMRI machine to show that this circuit that I've just told you about is activated when they see a threatening face and their inability to disengage from a face. Okay, so now, is there a causal link between this bias and anxiety? First answer I'll give you is with children. And the answer is yes. We've been studying, as Pat mentioned, we've been studying temperamentally fearful children for many years. We call them behaviorally inhibited. And here you see a graph which shows you data from children who have used or have been taken the dot probe. Now, when you have a positive score in the dot probe, that means that you have an attention-biased threat. And if you look at this for a second, what you'll see here is we have children who are high in this temperament of behavioral inhibition, and we have whether they are anxious or not. And here you see angry and happy faces, and this red bar here means that you have an attention-biased threat. And what you can see is that it's only the children who are high in anxiety and high in this temperamental fear who are showing this enhanced attention-biased threat. It's as if it's a biomarker for anxiety in this particular temperament. We've also shown this longitudinally. That is, we've started out with children who don't show anxiety but have this temperamental fear, and we've followed them over time. And what you can see is that this attention-biased threat moderates the link between early temperament and later anxiety. There you can see that right here, that the children who are high in behavioral inhibition and have an attention-biased threat, they're more likely to have, to develop anxiety later on. So it predicts which children are going to go on to develop anxiety and which are not. Okay, so now how do we establish this causal link between the dot probe task of an attention-biased threat and anxiety? Well, one way to do that is to train children on the dot probe. And the way that we train children on the dot probe is instead of those two dots being either in the congruent or the incongruent, we put the two dots always in the space where the angry face existed. So yes, we train children to get anxious by showing them over and over again the dot probe, the face, with the two congruent dots in the same place where the angry face. You can look at this here, and you can see that we start off, we assess the children, then we train them to attend to the angry faces, and then we test them. Are they more stressed out? Are they more anxious after the training? And so what's the answer? So the answer is, does attention training change the attention bias? The answer is yes, we can train an attention bias. Does attention training alter state anxiety and depression? The answer is yes. And does attention training increase vulnerability to stress? And the answer is yes. Now, before you go out and call the IRB on me to say, you know, this guy at Maryland is training kids to become more anxious, let me just say that we do this experiment in the lab, and we follow these kids up after that one experiment, because immediately after, they are in fact more anxious, and immediately after, they are more stressed, but it doesn't last, right? Because we've only done it for a short period of time in the lab. And in fact, to satisfy the IRB, we even went back and brought the kids back in to make sure that, in fact, they weren't more anxious. But the point is, we were able to show in the laboratory that we could manipulate the attention bias and make kids more anxious. But I'm not in the business of making people anxious. I can do this with adults, I can do this with children, but that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to flip it. Instead of training a bias to threat, we want to train away from threat. And so what we do is we use the dot probe and the attention bias that you can measure with the dot probe to reduce anxiety. And the way that we do that is we train children away from threat. So instead of the two dots always co-occurring in the space where the angry face was, they now always co-occur in the space where the neutral face is. So in order for the child to be accurate and to respond, they have to disengage their attention from the angry face and respond to the neutral face. Everybody follow that? Because that's important in terms of the mechanism by which we can, in fact, train a reduction in this attention bias to threat. So we train them away from threat, and in fact, when we recruit a group of children who were socially anxious, they were going in, they were on a waiting list for treatment for social anxiety at a clinic, and they were randomly assigned to either be in our attention training or in a placebo condition or in a neutral condition. What you can see there is that, in fact, post-treatment, we can reduce their anxiety symptoms. And it's not only that we can reduce their anxiety symptoms for only a short period of time, but we can follow them up over time to see whether or not that reduction in anxiety has lasted. And in fact, it does last, but not without a booster. So one of the things that we do is we give booster sessions to these kids, right? In order for them to be trained again to disengage their attention from threat towards the neutral face. So, does reducing an attention bias to threat reduce anxiety? The evidence from our lab and from other labs around the world suggests that attention bias modification successfully reduces anxiety symptoms in a wide range of anxiety. It's not only social anxiety, but it's also generalized anxiety, and even in some cases in terms of specific phobia. So in fact, there are researchers who are interested in spider phobia, who've used, instead of faces, angry faces and neutral faces, they've used spiders and non-threatening images of other insects. And they found that they can reduce spider phobia with this particular kind of training. And it can be used with children, and it's been used with adults. So what are the pros of this particular kind of training? Well, the first is cost, right? We've got this computerized task, which can be easily disseminated and which doesn't cost very much. So in hard-to-reach places, or for children or adults who don't want to participate in more other kinds of therapies, it's a pretty cost-effective way of reducing anxiety. And it doesn't have the stigma that sometimes going to a psychotherapist or to a clinic may have. Now, my father used to say, ignore everything before the but. So as a researcher, I have to say, there are caveats that we have to say about this attention training. The effects sometimes can be weak, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not there. We also don't exactly know right now how long the training should be. Our training regimen is 4 weeks, but it could be longer. And it's not all anxious individuals show an attention bias to threat. So for example, in maltreated children, you can see here on the left, these are children with high physical abuse, that's the blue, or children who have PTSD, they have an attention bias away from threat as opposed to attention bias towards threat. And I want to end with one remarkable study that a student of mine who's now professor at Tel Aviv University did some years ago. What you could see up there is a map that was published in the Israeli newspaper during a period of time when Scud missiles were coming down on the Israeli population. And you can see here how long it took individuals to seek shelter. So red, you only had 15 seconds, orange, 30 to 45 seconds, yellow, 60 seconds. And what you can see here is there's a gradation, right? And then, obviously, there were those that were out of the range. So his name was Yair Bar Chaim. He's a professor at Tel Aviv University. He had the crazy idea of going to measure anxiety and PTSD in people in these different areas and also give them the dot probe. And so here's what he found. He found heightened PTSD symptoms that decreased as a function of distance from threat. He found heightened depression that decreased as a function of threat, and obviously heightened state anxiety as a function of decreased threat. But here's what he found with the dot probe, that in fact all of these individuals, except for the individuals who are out of range, were showing a bias away from threat as opposed to a bias towards threat. So it's not always that a bias towards threat is associated with particular conditions and particular contexts. And I think that that's sort of the issue that we need to confront when we're doing a training. There's always heterogeneity of outcome. So my conclusions: it's possible to train anxious individuals to reduce their threat biases. These training procedures are generally effective in reducing vulnerability to stress. And we believe, at least now, that this is a meaningful step towards a translation of the basic cognitive neuroscience to create effective interventions for anxious children and individuals. I didn't bring with me the link to our website where we have all of the training materials, but I'd be glad to give it to anybody who might be interested. But it's freely available, it's downloadable, and you can try it yourselves, and I recommend that you do. So what are the next steps for us? We need more bias training studies, and we need to standardize those training procedures with the amount of training and the type of training. But with that, I believe that we are a step closer towards integrating the basic neuroscience, the basic cognitive science, to allow us to help young children with anxiety disorders to lead a better and productive life. Thank you.